Hello, and a warm welcome back to this part 5 of our 7-part series. Through the preceding 4 parts, we've established important background for the contemporary practice of sex work. In part 3, I had the pleasure of introducing you to a few friends, and we also benefited greatly from the outstanding research undertaken by leading academic researchers, including Elizabeth Bernstein. In part 4, we made a major excursion into an intensive look at the gendered aspect of most sex work. I hope you've enjoyed these segments and that they've given you much food for thought. This segment is different. Here we need to take a deep breath and to look with eyes wide open at the unspeakable violence that has been perpetuated against vulnerable women in this field. We also need to consider the pathologies that afflict the daily lives of many walking wounded sex workers. Having done so, we will need to keep walking. We cannot stop there with a mere recapitulation of these tragedies. And so we'll try to understand, or more precisely, point to what we need to find out in order better to understand. At the outset of this segment, we need to take a moment to remind ourselves of the terrible crimes that have slaughtered or otherwise violently victimized so many street-based sex workers in Canada. We will also touch upon the troubling research findings that have shown that among female substance abusers seeking treatment, sex workers have constituted a disproportionately large share. We will assert that for all the partial findings and newspaper headlines, little or no quantitative research of merit has been published concerning the prevalence and causes of pathologies among the primary contemporary populations of sex workers. We'll review in detail the gaps that are characteristic of much of the well-intentioned but poorly designed research that has been conducted to date. And to address those gaps in a constructive manner, we'll propose a first-cut multi-factor model that provides the logical structure for the definitive longitudinal study that has never yet been undertaken. The horrific violence perpetrated in the Vancouver downtown east side against sex workers can never be forgotten. For a summary of this violence, we turn to the account by the outstanding West Coast-based organization, the Pivot Legal Society. And I quote, "The DTES has the lowest per capita income of any region of the country. It is a neighborhood with a high concentration of social problems. Epidemics of drug overdose and HIV have developed among its population of approximately 4,700 injection drug users. Within this context of poverty, addiction, and disease, the DTES is also home to a sizable population of street-level sex workers. The sex trade in the DTES is characterized by disproportionate numbers of women, many of whom are Aboriginal, who are at high risk of poverty, violence, and abuse. Under the current legal conditions, sex workers experience extraordinarily high levels of violence. At the time this report was written, 2004, 63 women had been reported missing from the downtown east side, more than half of whom were Aboriginal. This epidemic of missing women is taking place across the country. Large numbers of sex workers have been reported missing or found dead in other major cities. At the time of writing, Robert Pickton faced charges for the murders of over 26 workers from Vancouver's DTES. In January 2004, Donald Backer was charged with 16 counts of sexual assault and is being investigated for sadistic sexual assaults against at least 50 sex workers. These publicized incidents represent the most visible manifestations of a widespread culture of violence against sex workers. For every woman who is missing or killed, many more have survived extreme violence while working in the sex trade. Similar serial violence has been perpetrated against sex workers in other Canadian cities, such as in Edmonton, Alberta. Here we see a dated view of some of the many women, not necessarily sex workers in the photo panel, who are murdered or were or are missing in Edmonton and surrounding regions of Alberta. I present the photos on the right so we all correlate in our minds the terrible numerical statistics with people, with attractive women in the prime of their lives who were killed and likely endured terrible suffering in the course of offering themselves to others in one of the most sociable and generous ways possible. Unfortunately, the pathologies that are linked with sex work do not end with violence. They have a larger reach among the walking wounded, including among those who seek help for the scourge of substance abuse. Among those entering substance use treatment, surviving sex workers elsewhere have been overrepresented among those having mental health symptoms and infectious diseases. To interpret the findings on this page, what this research signifies is that if you go into a substance abuse treatment center and interview the clients entering, you will discover that a rather high proportion of them have been involved in prostitution, and that those who have indeed been so involved have a profile that differs somewhat from those entering substance abuse treatment who have not been so involved. Specifically, those with a history of prostitution are more likely to have attempted to commit suicide, 44% more likely for women after adjustments, 19% more likely to have made a recent attempt. They are also more likely to have various sexually transmitted diseases. For example, even after controlling for intravenous drug use, a strong risk factor for HIV, the study found an adjusted odds ratio for HIV of 3.2 among sex workers, implying that those with a history of prostitution were 3.2 times as likely as other individuals entering treatment to be HIV positive. In terms of what substance was the source of addiction, the sex workers entering treatment were 3.5 times as likely to be seeking treatment for crack cocaine than other entrants. In terms of the mental health problems found, the female sex workers had higher rates of psychosis and anxiety. This research makes abundantly clear the existence of a population of extremely unwell sex workers. Although this may be well known, it's clearly troubling, and any policy response to sex work must present a realistic strategy for confronting these problems. But here comes the enormous caveat that I know you've been waiting for. We should absolutely not extrapolate from studies of this nature to the profile of specific segments of sex workers, to sex workers as a whole, or, for that matter, to women who have sex with men on planet Earth. That's because there is a built-in selection bias to a study of this nature. In order to be included in the sample, you needed to be showing up in the first place for treatment for substance use disorder. And a study of this nature cannot speak to the direction of causality. Certainly, the authors of this study are scrupulous in avoiding any such generalizations. But even studies that purport to go out and recruit workers closer to their place of work often encounter methodological problems of this form, as we'll see in a moment. The darkness overshadowing sex work has two meanings, because there is darkness also in the sense of the limits to current knowledge. Studies concerning psychological and health outcomes of sex work are missing the most basic and crucial information required to drive evidence-based policy, namely incidence and causality by work environment. In the absence of such data, those outside the field can only speculate whether the causes of such pathologies are features integral to sex work, such as the sex, or merely contingent circumstances of common contemporary work environments that have been managed to this point outside the law and therefore outside enforceable standards. In truth, there is so much critically important data that we don't have. Arguably, in the interim, the best repository of information for many of these questions is in the knowledge of sex workers themselves. But in order to regulate the industry and to encourage its evolution in a direction that is best for the health and well-being of all those directly involved, we will need to get the data through formal research. Crucially, we need to do so in a comparative fashion across alternative work environments. In Canada, we have now considerable evidence concerning the severe hazards of doing sex work on the streets in environments such as the downtown east side of Vancouver. But that accounts for a very small proportion of sex work. To repeat an analogy from a previous segment, we would never mistake visible hot dog vendors on the street for the immensely larger group of those who practice the culinary arts. In a moment, we'll discuss the kind of study we'd ultimately need to approach this adequately. But first, we'll take as a case study the results of an existing research project that has unfortunately fallen well short of addressing the gaps in our knowledge. In bygone eras, the Canadian public and policymakers had the benefit of authoritative research carefully compiled by experts assembled by royal commissions. In the public policy discourse leading up to Bill C-36, we had little beyond a self-published essay released in February 2014 entitled The Tipping Point by Canadian Member of Parliament Joy Smith. The Honourable Joy Smith relied heavily upon an article published by Melissa Farley, a researcher and anti-prostitution advocate, entitled Prostitution and Trafficking in 9 Countries, an update on violence and post-traumatic stress disorder. Farley and her team provide statistical evidence concerning the high levels of violence and pathology, among those included in their sample. However, the same study offers no useful segmented analysis by market, channel, or background. So, for example, it does not offer segmented results for women who've worked only in the middle class, post-industrial, internet-mediated, hotel-based, and outcall agency forms of prostitution that receive attention in Elizabeth Bernstein's analysis. Inexplicably, the Canadian sample is selected entirely from women in or near Vancouver's downtown east side, which, as we noted earlier and as noted in this study, is one of the most economically destitute regions in North America. 95% of the Canadian participants recruited for the study are drug users, and 86% had experienced current or past homelessness. Now, in light of our discussion at the outset of this segment, no one should discount the deeply disturbing pathologies that Farley and her team found where they were looking. But these results are not sufficiently fine-grained or generalizable to guide policy. Frequencies for items such as physically assaulted in prostitution and raped in prostitution do not indicate in which work environments such events occurred. Farley and team note that they found no differences among several different environments in Mexico, but that comparison actually appears to have been based on where the respondent was met by the researcher, not the environment in which the offenses occurred. This is a severe limitation, considering that in Mexico, the same workers generally flow among the various environments, and often during a single 24-hour period. To develop evidence-based policy, and certainly to contemplate laws that address certain classes of environments, as does in effect the advertising ban of Bill C-36, we absolutely need the data by work environment. So if the research designs of the 2 examples we've just reviewed fall entirely short of what we need, what would a gold standard research project look like? I'm going to go out on a major limb here now and propose just such a design. In order to know how to think about and how to respond to the various forms of sex work in our society, we need to know the actual incidence of problems in each of those forms. From the fragments of information already gathered, we know we should be on the lookout for both psychological, including mental health and substance use, and physical health problems. And as discussed, we know now clearly that we need this data per work environment. But it's not enough to simply describe the frequencies of those affected in sex work. What matters very largely from a policy perspective is how individuals came to be affected in that manner. So conceptually, we need to know to what extent there was a higher prevalence at entry, which would imply some degree of self-selection into sex work, versus personal psychological and physical deterioration during the sex work career due to the sex work itself, versus, for the sake of completeness, personal deterioration during that career but due to unrelated factors. And by the way, with the wording here, for example, in that second box, I certainly don't mean to anticipate the study results. This study could just as easily find, as far as I'm concerned, that the sex workers in some of the samples, some of the categories, do outstandingly well in their lives during the study as compared with the control participants. But in any case, even then, we're not even close to being done, because if at the end of the study we do find that there has been a deterioration in certain segments during the course of the study, we need to know what caused it. So, based on a brainstorming exercise I conducted in a room with the door closed by myself, I've arrayed a set of purely hypothetical stressors here on the right-hand side. So as you look through those, it's important to recognize that different findings would be pivotally important to rational policy responses. So let's give a few examples. If we were to find that the predominant problem were to be legal problems for sex workers, that is routine hassling and time wastage with the police, the consequences of criminal records and the like, then we'd realize that we're not helping any with the existing legal regime, and that we need to get those existing criminal records sealed and pardoned. On the other hand, if we find that the problem is the popularly supposed yuck factor, the first item mentioned, then we'd know that we need environments in which sex workers have much more choice in the clients they serve. If the problem is self-esteem, then we need to work hard to eliminate social stigma, root and branch in our society, and to elevate the status of the profession, something that is long overdue in any case. If the problem is financial stresses, then we'd know that we need to do a much better job of creating experiences for clients that feel safe and secure, that enable the differentiation of service offerings like in any other industry, and therefore command a premium. So even from these few illustrations, which only scratch the surface of the range of conceivable findings, we can see that a rational and just policy response is going to depend heavily upon whatever facts turn out to be borne out in the data collected. And this makes it all the more urgent that this study be undertaken. Now, give me a second to outline a few study design details to any social scientists who may be watching. If that's not you, please feel free to fast forward to the next slide. With respect to improving our grasp of causality, we need a longitudinal study, one that tracks over the course of several years the progress through life of the research subjects. We also need researchers to try much harder to control as best they can for the personal state of incoming sex workers at initiation. One promising research design would be a longitudinal matched sample design, whereby relatively new sex workers would be recruited into the research project and matched with individuals with comparable levels of human and social capital, including presence of family, education, and intelligence, together with comparable age, race, immigration status, and childhood sexual abuse status. Study participants would be evaluated as close as possible to initiation. The controls would ideally be matched, but if matching is deemed impractical due to recruitment challenges and/or the number and nature of control variables, then statistical control is an option so long as there's a heavy overlap in the control and subject samples along most control variables. Over the course of 10 or 15 years, your teams will maintain contact with these individuals and track their progress in life towards their stated goals and their accumulation of various markers of success or risk factors and markers for poor or good physical and mental health. With respect to the sex worker sample, researchers will monitor at intervals with a field-conducted survey the levels of various types of stressors noted on the right here. The study would also monitor the shifts worked, average hours per shift, the average number of clients seen per shift, and the average income per equivalent appointment by work environment. Because work environments for sex work are so different in the risk profiles they present, it is important that you recruit large enough diverse samples so that the influence of work environment comes through. For women who have worked during a study interval in more than one type of environment, the data on the stressors needs to be accumulated as best possible for each such environment for each respondent, as well as overall. If the samples are large enough and hold up over time, and the respondents turn out to be specialized enough by staying in one type of environment, it might be possible at the conclusion of the study to discard participants from the sex worker sample who have worked in more than one environment. In terms of the research segments proposed here, most are self-explanatory. However, floating worker brothel, that's A2, implies a sort of large, secure establishment with private rooms with doors found throughout Germany and in much of South America, in which sex workers are on their feet or on elevated stools and can move about freely to initiate or terminate conversations with prospective clients present, and by doing so, exercise some choice in selecting and screening them. A floating worker limited service strip club, A1, is an establishment lacking rooms with doors in which sexual intercourse is not generally provided. This will be a large, expensive, and ethically complex multi-site study to undertake, but with the results, the public all over the world will be in a much better position to form general awareness, and policymakers will be able to create responses and regulations, as we've seen, that respond to the facts as opposed to stereotypes, half-truths, and misconceptions. It is truly a crying shame that nothing like this study has been done to date. Faculties of social work, sociology, psychology, and public health, among others, in universities around the world, have much to answer for in having neglected such a perennially important realm of study to this point. However, on the plus side, if done now, this study will be at least in a position to study the internet-mediated post-industrial segment, C and also some B, highlighted by Elizabeth Bernstein. Now, this is a study to get at the incidence and roots of psychological and mental health problems, and it will take a while to generate results. In the meantime, research teams in the field of criminology, among others, need to get cracking to acquire, code, and analyze cases of reported violence perpetuated against sex workers. Again, they need to be attentive to environment. If someone were to ask how many homicides or aggravated assaults of performers were committed by clients or employees in or near Canadian strip clubs during the past 20 years, would anyone even know the answer to that question? How about the same question for small managed in-calls? And if not, why don't we have those statistics readily at hand in this debate? Here we are in the middle of a debate of a generation on sex work, and I don't know, potentially no one has the answers to these basic questions. As I said in a previous slide, in Canada we used to use royal commissions to bring these basic facts out of the woodwork, and it is much to be regretted that this step has been skipped in the current debate. However, these questions are inescapable. They are of the essence to the current policy debate, and they need to be addressed. Now, returning to the strategy here aimed at physical and psychological problems among sex workers, this is a research strategy that is attentive by design to self-selection biases that arise from the manner in which individuals select themselves into sex work. Some of these self-selection biases are obvious. If you're a crack cocaine addict, you might not readily find a straight working environment that accommodates and permits your addiction to the extent that street-based sex work does. But apart from substance abuse, other biases may not necessarily be so evident. So let's take a moment to check out a self-descriptive example from the recent literature. Mariko, in a conversation among 3 sex workers that was cited in a couple of slides in part 2 of this series, had the following to say, and I quote, "Sex work has been an integral part of therapy and my own form of recovery from sexual and dating trauma." Skipping ahead. "For researchers who try to paint the actual sex work as the trauma, it is hard for them to understand that many sexual assault survivors have used certain taboo sexual activities to overcome their own stigma and shame of themselves and whatever events happen to them which were outside their control. Contrary to what some psychologists decree, there is indeed a great degree of control that a sex worker has over her client if she chooses to seek out clients and working conditions that she can control. We can immediately see from an account like this that there are multiple reasons, some of them benign, why women with complicated personal histories might self-select into sex work." And a couple of words about stigma, which was one of the independent variables highlighted in the slide setting out the first cut multi-factor model. Looking to Susan, another one of the participants in that same discussion, stigma is clearly a self-perpetuating dynamic and one that undermines self-esteem and also increases vulnerability. And I quote, "When you're feeling low, you're more vulnerable in a sex work situation." I think that speaks to the whole idea of self-esteem, which is so important in sex work. This is all related to the shame and stigma versus empowerment question. The shame and stigma that come with sex work can modify a woman's self-esteem if she doesn't own the sex work, if she hasn't deconstructed those negative societal views surrounding the work and the ideas of what a woman is supposed to be in our society. Until more telling data is available, we need obviously first to focus on getting that data, but beyond that, in the policy realm, to develop cautious but generous responses. After all, we wouldn't ban women from the practice of medicine or arrest their patients, despite that it's known that female physicians commit suicide between 2.5 and 5.7 times as frequently and have a higher incidence of alcoholism as compared with members of the general population. Nor would we outlaw restaurants or construction work, despite that 17% of food service workers in the USA use illegal drugs, and about 16% of construction workers are quote-unquote heavy drinkers. Nor would we stop providing therapy to the criminally insane, despite that across the border in New York State, inmate attacks on civilian staff at one facility increased in 1 year by 144% to 39 assaults in 10 months. Nor would we, obviously, stop women from entering the military or deploying, or bar men from enlisting. Even given that 37% of U.S. female veterans report being raped at least twice, and 79% report persistent experiences of sexual harassment. Look, in all such cases, as in the case of sex work in Canada, intelligent policy responses can and should be developed. This isn't an argument for stasis or standing by and doing nothing in the face of troubling social phenomena. But often there is very little call for a sledgehammer in public policy. Sometimes, often even, the right answer is to say, we're still getting the data. We're not prepared yet to offer a comprehensive policy response. But in the meantime, we'll do what we can to reduce the human suffering in plain view. Of course, such a position takes humility and integrity. Let's conclude by calling out and condemning in the most strenuous manner possible that truly appalling violent crimes have been committed against sex workers in Canada. Let's also observe that in many U.S. centers, sex workers have been overrepresented among those receiving treatment for substance abuse, and at treatment facilities, they've often presented additional conditions associated with poor physical and mental health. In terms of the limits to current knowledge, the incidence of violence and other pathologies by type of sex work environment is currently unknown. Further research is urgently required and needs to be adequately funded. We've proposed here one possible research design. And finally, in the absence of in-depth knowledge, our policy responses need to be formulated carefully, be generous, and be focused on the problems in plain sight. I'd like to thank you for staying with me all the way to this point in the segment, and I look forward to seeing you in Part 6, in which we will briefly consider some of the ramifications of the proposed legislation, but we'll spend most of our time setting out, for the purposes of contrast, an alternative, creative, and better crafted policy. See you then.